But in some ways, they're like other children of our family, right? They're little furry animal friends that we need to take care of after they're gone. So we have to provide for their care, or if we want someone in particular to take care of them, we have to set aside possibly some money to take care of them and pay for health expenses, things like that might be coming up. You don't want to necessarily saddle someone with a burden either that they weren't prepared for. So there's a lot of things that you can do to prepare for what happens if you pass before your pet. And this is in particular very helpful for animals that live a long time, or if you get an animal later in life. So welcome everybody. I'm attorney Justin Randall here with Hooper Law Office. Just a couple housekeeping items before I get too in depth onto our topic today. But if you are participating via Zoom, you can ask me questions as I go along here. There's a Q&A function. I can see the chat box come up. So if you have a question on anything, please just feel free to ask, and it's anonymous. So, we don't know who's asking the questions. But another thing too, is if you signed up in advance, there's a couple materials you'll receive from us. One is a book from our office that we wrote where it covers some of the topics we're going to talk about today, as well as a kind of pet planning consideration, why you need to do this. If you have a pet that you're thinking about leaving anything for their care, there's certain considerations you need to keep in mind. So obviously with that, our topic today is we're talking about pet planning and different types of ways to incorporate them into your estate plan, or not just your estate plan, but how to make sure that they're cared for if something happens to you while you're living as well. If there's an incapacity, there's certain things that you might want to do to make sure that someone knows that you've got a pet at home who might be alone and need checking in on if something happens to you. There's a lot of people who have pets their entire lives, right? And some people, as they get older, decide maybe, I won't get another pet because I'm aging. But some people really, that's an integral part of their life, is they've had pets that whole time, and they really need that companionship. So one of the biggest reasons you might plan for pets, one being, as I sort of mentioned a little bit ago, that some animals live a really long time, and longer than humans do. I mean, you've probably all heard the example of the tortoise that lives 150 years, right? Or the parrot, or types of birds that live almost 100 years as well. So depending on when you get them in your life, they're very likely going to outlive us. So not only animals that live a long time, but potentially animals that require a lot of expensive maintenance and upkeep, like larger animals, like horses in particular, require a lot of care and a lot of food, and their vet bills are expensive. So if you're leaving anything behind to care for an animal like that, you really need to do the proper planning, make sure you're talking about who might take care of that animal, or where you're going to, how much money you're going to leave for the care of that animal, and how you're going to explain the types of care that animal might need if there's any sort of health concerns in particular, right? But so animals that live a long time, that's one thing, but there's also the people who get pets throughout their life, and including maybe later in life when they need that companionship. And there's always the possibility then that the older we get, our pets might outlive us, right? If I got a puppy at age, and I was age 90, that dog might outlive me. So you need to plan for those animals as well. And unfortunately, there's a lot of information out there that either, people are just expecting people to take care of their animals and not necessarily leave any money in the process, and just think someone's going to be willing to take that on. But there's also some information out there that might be a little too oversimplified on how you want to actually do that planning. Things like, oh, I'll just, and I've had friends in my own life, ask me this question too for their own pets, is, oh, can I just provide a little statement in my will for my cat or for my dog, and make sure that someone's there to take care of them. Like, am I willing my cat to somebody? And it's, that's a good thought, but it's not quite as simple as that. So when you're talking about setting up care for an animal, you want to think about a couple of really key things. One, does that animal have any sort of, particular concerns, health requirements, special types of food that it needs to eat? Did you adopt an animal with special needs, like a blind or a deaf dog, for example, something like that. Any sort of information that the person taking care of them is going to need to be aware of in order to properly care for that animal. And, do they have any sort of behavioral things they need to be aware of? Are there certain things that they like? I mean, it's the same way you would think about providing for a child in some ways of, this is the information that I'm leaving behind for a loved one. And that's really what you're doing. So, those are the types of considerations as well, but also talking with people that before you just decide to leave animals to them. Are they okay taking on that responsibility? Is it something that they're willing to do? Something they have the experience to do? Are they, is it right for their life too? I mean, like you wouldn't want to necessarily will a horse, for example, to a 95-year-old who just doesn't have the capability to take care of that, right? It wouldn't make a lot of sense. So there's a lot of pre-planning that goes into where you decide to leave these things or these animals. And it's not always an individual that either. A lot of times it can be that you provide a fund to a rescue of some kind or an organization for the care of your animal so that you can make sure that somebody is there to take care of it, whether it's someone or somebody at an organization like an animal rescue who is more equipped to handle it, at least until they find a forever home for it, right? Those are really important things to look at. How much money you leave behind for an animal can vary depending on the type of animal it is, the health of that animal and the health requirements of that animal, and obviously how much it generally costs to keep that animal in good health and care for it. Obviously, you're going to need to leave a lot more money for an animal that, like I mentioned, like a tortoise, for example, that lives maybe 150 years. There's a lot more time that you have to provide for food, even just for that animal, let alone medical bills. But there's other animals like horses or larger animals that are, their food alone is much more expensive. The cost of keeping them maintained is much more expensive. And that's not even accounting for any unforeseen medical bills for the animal, which are always higher for larger animals too. So you need to there's no set amount of money that's going to be right to leave. It's going to depend a lot on maybe the number of pets you're leaving behind or planning for, the type of pet you're planning for, and, the particular health of that particular animal, not just a general sort of, cost for a horse versus a cat. It might be, well, my horse has particular health concerns, or my cat has particular health concerns that make it more expensive than it might be otherwise. So those are sort of the financial and sort of decision-making things you need to kind of get your head around before you decide exactly who you're going to leave the animal to, how you're going to provide for it, and how much you're going to provide for it. How we often do this type of planning is there's actually something called a pet trust that we use to do this. So it's sort of like leaving a trust for a child in that sense. You're leaving a set fund for that animal's care. You're dictating who might be in charge of that trust for that animal, who the caretaker might be, dictating how the funds can be used. Like, does it have to be used for certain types of care, or can it be sort of more general care? Those types of considerations. One thing that has been brought up by a number of the members in our office, and actually other professionals we work with, is that it's good to keep in mind not just the care for the animal, but is the caretaker allowed to use any of that money to give that animal a better home? Are there any home modifications they need to make for that animal? Like if a dog couldn't get up steps, right? Do they need to build a ramp into the house, or do they need to renovate the stables that the horse was living in? Whatever it might be, which again, the cost for those can obviously vary. But if those are things you expect they might need to do, and you want that person to take care of that animal and continue to do so the way you want them to, it's important to make sure that you're providing the funds for them to be able to do that, and not expecting them to necessarily spend their own money on it either. And the cost of this, again, is going to vary depending on the animal and the care needs of that animal. So those are pet trusts are sort of those trust funds, if you will, for those animals. It always reminds me, and because it sounds sort of silly when you think about it, right? What a pet trust, you think of a trust fund for a pet, but it's really a useful tool, actually. I mean, I was reading a story not that long ago of, I think it was of the wealthiest animals in history, and there was this example of somebody left millions of dollars, which I'm not saying you should do this, but they left millions of dollars for the care of their dog. With the requirement that go to their care, but it also was used to like supplement the I believe the shelter that it was at too, but that dog was a millionaire, a multimillionaire because of that. So that's obviously an extreme example, but you leave money for the care of that animal so that they can be provided for and that you're not putting a burden on anybody unnecessarily. So those are the types of planning that you might need to do when you're talking about what happens if I pass, right? What happens if I'm no longer around? But there are other sort of not necessarily legal document planning tools that we use to provide for the care of those animals as well. We've developed a couple of tools within our own office for various clients that we've now continued to use because they were useful. I mentioned earlier, what do you need to consider if you're out traveling, right? Or you're just out running errands and you left the dog at home and you get into an accident, but maybe you don't have a spouse, right? Maybe you're single and you need someone to know that that dog is home alone and that somebody should go check in on it. Just like you keep a lot of like organ donation things in your wallet, possibly or on your license, or different cards in your wallet. A tool we've developed is putting a card in, basically I have this pet at home. So if something happens to me and I'm unresponsive, please someone go check in on that pet. Don't let it go longer than a certain period of time without checking in on it, to make sure that your dog or your cat or whatever animal is at home is being checked in on while you're no longer able to, if you're in the hospital. This is less of a concern, obviously, for people who have family members who are regularly checking in on it and, maybe a spouse or kids going home. But if you live alone and you have an animal at home alone, it's important that somebody knows to check in on it so that, your cat or your dog or your pet of any kind is being checked in on and taken care of. We've also developed certain tools that deal with laying out the health considerations for certain animals. We've had clients in the past that are very interested in planning for or adopting animals that are older, like senior citizen dogs, the dogs with special needs or cats with special needs, animals that might have physical disabilities or special health considerations that are not your typical thing that you would expect someone to have to care for if it was just like a puppy you adopted, for example. So we've developed tools where it kind of lays out each animal, what their care needs are, what types of food they might need, and specifically those types of considerations, so that if you're incapacitated or you unexpectedly pass away, the information is there for that animal so that somebody can find it. And it's kind of like an emergency contact list in a sense, except here's the type of documentation I need for my animals and the type of care they're going to need, the type of food they're going to need to eat. So there's a couple of things as well that I want to go through that are part of this kind of consideration of pet planning as well. You'll get a sheet from us if you're signed up in advance on Zoom via email. You'll get this later. There's a couple of things that you just need to think about whenever you're planning for pets. So you really, really want to, I've mentioned a couple of these already, but so you want to make sure that certain people are notified if something happens to you, that your pet can be taken care of in that process. So that's where that card in your wallet can be very useful, explaining where the pet is, how to care for them, all of that. You should really pre-select the caregiver. You don't necessarily want to leave it up to chance for who it might be. And, it's kind of that assumption that a lot of people have that somebody in my family is going to take care of my animals. I know somebody will, but I don't know who, but I know somebody is going to step in, is a common thing we hear. But it's really important, just like when you're naming guardians for a kid, you want to name the guardian for the animal, the caretaker for that animal, and make sure that they're capable of handling it. I sort of alluded to this earlier, but you don't really want to just assume that someone is going to be capable of handling it, especially if you're talking about an animal that might need more care than others, and you're leaving it potentially to someone who is physically unable themselves to care for that animal, or financially unable to care for that animal. So sometimes if you don't have anybody in mind, or you don't have anybody who would be capable of taking care of that animal, that's where it's really important to involve rescue organizations or animal care organizations that exist, charities that might exist out in the community. Horses, for example, require so much care. And if somebody is not familiar with caring for a horse or does not have that experience, it's incredibly difficult for them to just suddenly learn to do it. For example, I would have no idea where to even begin. So you would not want to leave your horse to me because I wouldn't know what to do with it. I would have to go get help. So you definitely want then, if you don't have that individual who's capable of caring for that animal, to look at community organizations that exist that, in some ways, like any charity, maybe meet your giving patterns that you have, or your charitable goals that you have, provide the right type of care for your animal, or what that would sort of reflect what you would want for their care. You wouldn't want to leave, for example, an animal that, if you were really against animal euthanization or anything like that, you wouldn't necessarily want to leave your animal to an organization that isn't a no-kill shelter, right? So, I mean, that's just an example of that. You really want to make sure that you're leaving them to the right place. This is sort of more of a personal, sort of quirky thing that can happen. As we all know with our pets, they all have their own individual personalities, right? My cat, for example, is a talker, and she is very mouthy and will let you know her mind. So there's certain types of food that she likes, or certain types of pillows that she likes to sleep on, for example, or whatever it might be. But you really want to lay out what those individual quirks and personalities for your animals are. Some dogs, for example, are very, very in certain situations, maybe more aggressive than they might be in a comfortable situation. I had a dog growing up, for example, was the sweetest dog in the world, unless you got close to his food. So otherwise a perfect dog, but that's the kind of thing you might want to let someone know, hey, while my dog's eating, don't go anywhere near him. Let him eat in his own room by himself, something like that. So let me just make sure I covered all of that. So if you, one of the biggest concerns, and this is where the legal planning really comes in with that pet trust. This can really apply to a lot of different types of estate planning, not just pet planning, but you never want to give money to somebody outright, expecting them to provide care for a certain person, or to use the money a certain way, or to share the money amongst beneficiaries. But in particular with pets, I would not say, I'm leaving $10,000 for the care of my dog or my cat or my horse, but I'm leaving it directly to that person who I expect to be the caretaker. When you leave it to somebody outright like that, you open up the possibility that they may not use the money as intended. The benefit of that sort of pet trust, or that structured inheritance for that animal, is that they are, as the caretaker or as the trustee for that pet trust, required to use it a certain way. If I just left money to somebody expecting them to care for that animal, but it was just a cash distribution, there's no guarantee that they will use that money as I've asked them to, right? And there's no repercussions if they don't either. If you just leave money to somebody, that's their money, and they can do what they please with it. They can spend it, they can give it away, they could use it for the care of that animal, but they are not required to. So if you are planning to provide money for the care of your animal, doing so in a structured pet trust like that is really important, to make sure that they are obligated to use it for a certain purpose. Or maybe not necessarily a pet trust, but if you're giving money to an organization for the care of that animal, that you are earmarking it specifically with that organization for that, so they are obligated to use it the right way. A pet trust is still the safest way, because then the terms of the trust are what you set up. You're not relying on sort of an outside organization's own rules for that. Like I said, this goes to all sorts of estate planning. It's the same reason you don't just leave money to one kid expecting them to share it amongst their siblings. They're just not required to at that point. But especially if you're talking about the care of an animal, you need to make sure that you're setting it up in such a way that the person who is going to receive that money, or have that money under their direction, that they're required to use it for the right purposes. Okay. pulling up here, making sure we don't have any questions. One other thing as well is, sometimes there is money when somebody inherits money directly or is left money directly, not just the fact that they're not required to use it for certain purposes, but they may not be able to use it for certain purposes. So if somebody left me money, just $5,000, let's say, and then suddenly I had to file for bankruptcy for some reason, or I was sued, there was a lawsuit judgment out there, I was getting divorced. I mean, you can think of any sort of like legal thing that can happen to somebody. Well, that also then happens to their assets. And if that money is within their control, you're setting it up so that potentially it's available for those concerns. With that sort of pet trust where it's set up for a certain purpose, it's set up for the care of the animal, those are not their assets then. So if I'm the trustee of someone's pet trust or someone's pet trust, then I am not the owner of that property. I am the trustee. I'm managing that property for the care of that animal, but I am not required to give it up for my own personal obligations at that point, because it's not my money. It's technically that pet's trust's money, and it's earmarked for their care, for their support. So it can be not necessarily I'm concerned about not having the person I'm leaving this money for the care of my animal use it properly, but also maybe they're in a situation where they cannot use it properly as you intended because they have legal obligations where they are unable to keep that money safe for the care of that animal. And then they're stuck in a situation where they want to provide care and help out, but they may not be able to because now they don't have the money to do so. So that's where a pet trust can be incredibly helpful too, is especially with more expensive animals, right? Like horses and larger animals or animals with incredible longevity. You want to make sure that money is not going to be available for someone's personal obligations. So these are the types of considerations that you have to have if you're planning for pets. I mean, there's always the situation where you can say, all right, I'm still relatively young. I'm not too concerned about my animal outliving me, but that doesn't sort of negate the fact that you want to provide for some sort of structure in their lives for someone to step in and take care of them in the event of an incapacity. Incapacities are not tied necessarily to someone's age. Anybody can get into a car accident. Anybody can have a health event unexpectedly where they may not be able to take care of their loved ones anymore, or their animals anymore. So even someone young has to potentially plan for what happens if they're no longer able to care for their pets. These are where situations like powers of attorney can be very helpful for you to have for not just your own personal finances, but so they can, access your personal finances for the care of the animal during your lifetime. But also those sort of non-legal documents where it's explaining where your pets are in terms of, hey, I have this pet at home, please go check in on them. If I'm in an accident, I'm, non-responsive, I need someone to go check in on that animal, and any sort of documentation you need for them to be cared for properly if they have special health considerations as well. With that, I'm not seeing a lot of questions here, but if anybody does have any questions, we do have the ability for, like I said, that Q&A box is still there. But if you have any questions after we get off this webinar today, feel free to email us at learnmore@hooperlawoffice.com. One thing to keep in mind too is if you've signed up for this in advance, you'll be receiving a feedback form from us. On that feedback form is a place where you can set up an initial consultation or mark that you would like us to reach out to set up that initial consultation. Those are complimentary. They don't cost you anything to come in and talk to us. We usually schedule them for about 2 hours or so. Be less depending on the complexity of the discussion or the, how many different topics we're trying to cover in that time if you have a lot of concerns, right? But it doesn't cost you to come in and talk to us if you have questions. So if you would like to set something like that up, if you have an animal you want to care for, or you have any sort of reason to set up a pet trust for, whether it's for charitable purposes or in terms of certain types of planning for children with special needs, where they might have some sort of therapy for like animal therapy, that can be important too. So it's not just tied to if it's only pets. I mean, it can be tied into a lot of various types of planning as well. So any of those concerns, feel free to come in and talk to us. Our topic next week is our very kind of traditional wills versus trust topic. So next Wednesday at the same time, we'll be talking more about just sort of traditional planning topics. What's the difference between a will and a trust? What types of the considerations you have to have for both of those things, and when one might be more appropriate than the other. So if that's an interest of yours or anything that you want to get some more information on, please feel free to join me next week. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you next week.